"Where's your car?" That was the question that started all of it, asked on a Sunday afternoon in the driveway of my own house, while my daughter stood there in a coat that wasn't warm enough for October, holding a grocery bag with exactly 4 items in it, having arrived on foot from a bus stop nearly a mile away. Her name is Casey. She's 29 years old, and until that moment I would have told you with total confidence that she was living a good life, married 3 years to a man named Trent Aldous Wexler, settled into a house in a subdivision outside Lancaster, Pennsylvania, that his mother had helped them buy, working part-time as a dental hygienist. The kind of steady, unremarkable happiness that parents spend their whole lives hoping their children will find. She didn't answer right away. She looked at the ground, adjusted the grocery bag against her hip and said, "It's in the shop," in a voice so flat and rehearsed that I knew immediately it was a lie. The kind of lie a person tells not to deceive you, but because they've told it so many times to themselves that it started to feel true. "The shop," I repeated. "Which shop?" "Dad." "Casey." She looked up at me then, and something in her face cracked, just slightly, at the corner of her eyes, and she said, "Can we not do this right now?" And I understood, in the particular way a father understands his own child even when she is trying very hard to be unreadable, that whatever was actually going on was much larger than a car. I want to explain who I am before I go further into this, because I think it matters for understanding what I did next and why. My name is Walter Reyes Halloran. I'm 58 years old. I spent 31 years as a claims investigator for a mid-sized insurance company outside Harrisburg before I retired 2 years ago. And if there is one skill that 31 years of that work gave me, it is this: an almost involuntary instinct for the shape of a story that doesn't add up. I have sat across tables from 1,000 people telling me 1,000 versions of what happened to their car, their house, their business. And I have learned to hear the difference between a true story, which has texture and inconsistency and the small, unglamorous details of real life, and a manufactured one, which is smooth and flat and always missing something specific. Casey's story about the car was missing something specific. It was missing a name, a location, a reason. It was the kind of sentence a person says when they've been told exactly what to say and have said it enough times that the words have worn a groove. I let it go that afternoon because pushing harder in that moment would have only closed the door further, and I have learned, in 31 years of asking people questions they didn't want to answer, that patience gets you further than pressure. I made her a cup of coffee. I asked about work, about her husband, about small things, and I watched her the entire time the way I used to watch a claimant across a table, nodding every place her answers came too quickly or too slowly, every place her eyes moved toward the window instead of toward me. By the time she left, her mother, Denise, drove her home, because apparently that was the arrangement now. Apparently my daughter had been without a car for reasons she would not name for at least several weeks. I had already decided that something was deeply wrong, and I had already decided, in the quiet, methodical way that had defined my entire professional life, that I was going to find out what it was. Denise didn't want me to push. That was the first real disagreement we had about it, sitting at our own kitchen table that same evening, the light going gold and then gray through the window over the sink. She said Casey was an adult, that whatever was happening in her marriage was hers to handle, that pushing too hard would only make our daughter feel cornered and pull further away. I understood the logic. I even agreed with parts of it. But there is a particular fear that lives in a father's chest, one I don't think mothers carry in quite the same shape, and it is the fear of being the man who saw something was wrong and did nothing because he was told it wasn't his business. I started with small things. I called Casey twice that week, ordinary calls, nothing that would alarm her, and in both conversations I asked gently about Trent, about his mother, a woman named Artis Wexler, whom I had met perhaps a dozen times over 3 years and had always found, if I'm honest, faintly overbearing in the particular way of mothers who never fully release their sons. And both times, Casey's answers came back thin and careful, the answers of someone reciting facts rather than living a life. It was my neighbor, Kurt Palladino, who owns the auto shop 2 towns over, who gave me the first real piece of the puzzle, though he didn't know it at the time. I mentioned, in passing, over a fence one Saturday morning that Casey's car was in the shop, and Kurt, who fixes half the cars in 3 counties and knows every mechanic within 40 miles, said he hadn't heard of any shop doing that kind of work lately, and asked, half joking, if she'd taken it somewhere out of the area. I laughed it off at the time, but the comment sat in my chest like a stone for the rest of the day. I did what I know how to do. I started asking around, carefully, the way you do when you don't want the person you're asking about to know you're asking. I called a woman named Priya Anand, who worked with Casey at the dental office, under the pretense of asking about a birthday gift, and in the course of that conversation, Priya mentioned, almost in passing, that Casey had been taking the bus to work for the last month, and that she'd overheard her on the phone once in the break room saying something about not being allowed to drive right now. A phrase that landed in my chest with the particular weight of a detail that doesn't fit any innocent explanation I could construct. Not allowed, not the cars in the shop, not we're saving money, not allowed as though someone else had made a decision about my daughter's mobility and my daughter had accepted it. I didn't sleep well after that conversation. I lay awake running through every version of a marriage that could produce a sentence like that, and none of the versions I could construct were good ones. I thought about the years I'd spent investigating insurance fraud, about how often the most dangerous situations were the quietest ones, not the dramatic ones, not the ones with visible bruises or shouted arguments the neighbors could hear, but the slow, methodical erosions, the ones built one small concession at a time, until a person woke up one day and realized they had no car, no money of their own, no friends they were still in contact with, and no clear memory of the moment any of it had actually been decided. I called my brother-in-law, a retired state trooper named Gene Marchetti, and asked him off the record what he thought about a son-in-law and his mother taking away a young wife's car and telling her she wasn't allowed to drive it. Gene was quiet for a long moment on the phone, and then he said the words that changed the entire shape of what I was doing. He said, "Walt, that's not about the car. Nobody controls a car because they care about the car." I began, after that, to watch my daughter's marriage the way I had once watched a fraudulent claim, not looking for a single smoking piece of evidence, because those rarely exist, but building a pattern, one small data point at a time, until the shape of the thing became undeniable even before I had proof of any single piece. Casey came to dinner 3 weeks after that first driveway conversation, and this time I noticed things I hadn't let myself notice before because I had been too focused, that first day, on the missing car to see the rest of the picture. She had lost weight, not a dramatic amount, but enough that her wedding ring, when she reached for the salt, slid slightly on her finger in a way it never had before. She checked her phone 4 times during dinner, each time with a small, tight flinch, as though she were checking not for messages but for the absence of a particular one. And when Denise asked, casually, what she and Trent had planned for the upcoming holidays, Casey said, "We'll see what Artie's wants to do," in a tone that made it clear the question had never once in 3 years of marriage actually been hers to answer. I want to be careful here, because I know how these stories can sound when they're told after the fact, shaped by everything that came later into something that seems obvious in hindsight but wasn't obvious at all in the moment. I did not, that night at dinner, see a woman in visible danger. I saw a woman who was tired, thinner than she should be, quieter than she used to be, deferring in small ways to people who weren't even in the room. If you had shown me a single one of those details in isolation, I would have told you it meant nothing. It was the accumulation that frightened me, the way 31 years of investigative work had taught me that danger rarely announces itself. It accumulates. The turning point came on a Thursday in November, nearly 6 weeks after the driveway conversation, when Casey called me at 11 at night, her voice so small and strange that for the first 3 seconds I didn't recognize it as hers. "Dad," she said, "can you come get me?" I did not ask questions. I have thought about that decision many times since. The decision not to ask where, not to ask why, not to ask what had happened, but simply to say yes and reach for my car keys. And I believe it was the single most important decision I made in the entire span of this story. There is a particular kind of trust required for a person to ask for help without being able to explain why they need it. And I understood, in the half-second before I answered her, that if I asked even one question, I might lose the narrow window in which she was brave enough to ask. She was standing outside a gas station on Route 30, nearly 8 miles from the house she shared with Trent, in a thin jacket in November at 11 at night, with a single duffel bag at her feet. When I pulled up, she got in the car without a word, and for the first 10 minutes of the drive, she said nothing at all, staring straight ahead at the road, her hands pressed flat against her knees as though she were holding herself together by physical force. It was somewhere around the halfway point of that drive, on the dark stretch of Route 30 that runs along the edge of the reservoir, that she started to talk. And once she started, it came out of her in a flood that I don't think she could have stopped even if she'd wanted to. It had started small, the way these things always do. Trent's mother, Artie's, had never fully accepted that her son had married someone she considered. Casey used this exact phrase, and I have never forgotten it, not quite Wexler enough. In the first year of the marriage, it had shown up as small comments, small corrections, small ways of positioning herself as the person who understood how things were really done in that family. By the second year, Artie's had begun handling more and more of the couple's finances, at first framed as help, as generosity, as a mother-in-law simply wanting to support her son's new household, until it reached a point where Casey no longer had access to their joint account without asking, first Trent, and then, increasingly, Artie's directly. The car had been the last thing they took, not the first. By the time the car disappeared, repossessed, Casey learned much later, not because of any real financial trouble, but because Artie's had quietly convinced Trent that Casey couldn't be trusted with family resources, after a minor fender bender 8 months earlier. An accident that had been, by any reasonable account, not remotely Casey's fault. She had already lost access to her own bank card. Her own credit history had been quietly rerouted through a joint account Artie's monitored. And her friendships, one by one, had been reframed by Trent as not good influences. Each one dismantled with the same patient, reasonable-sounding logic that made every individual decision seem, in isolation, almost sensible. "He never hit me," Casey said, somewhere past the halfway point of that drive, her voice breaking on the word never in a way that told me she had been bracing herself for that specific question and needed urgently to answer it before I could ask. "It was never that. It was never that." I did not say anything for a long moment because I understood, even in the middle of my own fear and fury, that what she needed from me in that moment was not a reaction. It was room. I have thought since about how many people, hearing that a marriage involved no physical violence, might have quietly filed the whole situation as less serious, might have told her, gently, that it didn't sound that bad, that perhaps it could be worked out, that mothers-in-law can be difficult but marriages survive difficult mothers-in-law all the time. I am grateful, more grateful than I can easily express, that 31 years of watching how damage actually accumulates in a human life had taught me better than that. What Trent and Artie's had built over 3 years patiently and without a single act anyone could point to as decisive was a cage constructed entirely of reasonable-sounding decisions. No car, because of an accident that wasn't her fault. No money, because Artie's was just helping manage things while Casey focused on her career. No friends, because each one, individually, had been recast as a bad influence, a distraction. Someone who didn't understand the family. No visits home, not forbidden exactly, just quietly discouraged, framed always as Trent's feelings, Trent's insecurity, Trent's need for her full attention, until visiting her own parents had become, in some deep and terrible way, an act that required permission she had stopped being able to ask for. The night she called me, the specific trigger, the thing that had finally cracked the careful architecture of that cage, was smaller than I expected and, in its smallness, somehow worse. Artie's had shown up at the house unannounced, as she often did, and had gone through Casey's phone while Casey was in the shower, and had found a single text message to an old college friend, a woman named Marisol Trejo whom Casey hadn't spoken to in over a year, a message that said nothing more incriminating than "I miss you. I miss my old life sometimes." And Artie's had shown the message to Trent, and the two of them had sat Casey down that evening in a conversation that Casey described, her voice flattening again into that same rehearsed tone from the driveway, as just a conversation about loyalty, though what it had actually been, by every detail she recounted in the rest of that drive, was something closer to an interrogation, hours of questions about what she meant by her old life, whether she was happy, whether she appreciated everything the family had done for her, whether she understood how it would look, how it would hurt Trent, how it would embarrass Artie's if she ever did something rash. It was the phrase "did something rash" that had finally broken through whatever fog 3 years of small accumulating losses had built around my daughter's judgment. She told me that somewhere around midnight, lying awake beside a husband who had fallen asleep as though the conversation had resolved something rather than revealed the entire shape of the last 3 years, she had understood, with a clarity she said felt almost physical, like a window opening in a room she hadn't realized was airless, that if she didn't leave that house that week, she might never leave it at all. I took her home that night, and I did not sleep, and neither, I suspect, did Denise, who sat up with Casey until nearly 4 in the morning, the two of them talking in low voices in the kitchen while I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, running through everything my daughter had told me with the same methodical precision I had once brought to a fraud investigation, except this time the fraud wasn't financial. It was a slow, deliberate theft of a person's autonomy, executed with such patience and such reasonable-sounding justification at every step that no single moment of it would have held up, on its own, as evidence of anything at all. The weeks that followed were harder than I expected, in ways that had nothing to do with legal paperwork or moving boxes, though there was plenty of both. Trent called constantly, at first apologetic, then confused, then, as the days went on, increasingly cold in a way that revealed, I think, more of his true character than 3 years of careful behavior ever had. Artie's called too, several times, and I answered exactly once, long enough to hear her describe Casey's departure as an overreaction to a private family matter, before I told her, as calmly as I could manage, that my daughter was safe, that she would be staying with us, and that any further conversation would happen through an attorney. Casey struggled in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, even having watched the whole architecture of her isolation unfold secondhand. She would apologize in the first weeks for small things, for taking too long in the shower, for asking to borrow the car, for expressing a preference about what to have for dinner, apologies that had no clear trigger except the deep, worn groove of 3 years spent anticipating disapproval before it arrived. She flinched at raised voices on television. She checked her phone obsessively for the first month, not out of any lingering attachment to Trent. She told me once, late at night, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold in her hands, but because she had spent 3 years believing that not checking her phone quickly enough constituted its own kind of failure. It took nearly 4 months before she felt safe enough to reconnect with Marisol, the friend whose single text message had triggered the final unraveling of her marriage. And I remember the evening Casey came home from that first dinner together, her face doing something I hadn't seen it do in over a year. A real laugh, unguarded, at some story Marisol had told her. And I remember standing in the kitchen doorway watching my daughter laugh like that, and feeling something in my chest that I can only describe as the specific, aching relief of watching a person slowly return to the shape they were always meant to hold. The divorce took the better part of a year to finalize, complicated by the fact that Trent's family retained lawyers considerably more expensive than anything Casey's modest savings could match, though her lack of financial independence, once the actual pattern of it was laid out in front of a judge, in painstaking detail, by an attorney I helped hire, became its own kind of evidence, more damning in its dry procedural accumulation than any single dramatic accusation could have been. The judge, a woman named Regina Fairweather Kwan, said something in the final hearing that I have carried with me since, something about how coercive control rarely announces itself with a single incident, how courts were only beginning, culturally and legally, to understand that the absence of a bruise did not mean the absence of harm, that a person could be genuinely, completely trapped inside a life that looked, from the outside, entirely ordinary. Casey is 31 now. She has her own apartment, a small one in a building not far from us, and her own car, which she bought herself, with her own money, from her own bank account. A fact she mentioned to me once with a kind of quiet, fierce pride that told me more about how far she'd come than any longer conversation could have. She started, 6 months ago, volunteering with a local organization that helps women recognize the early signs of the exact kind of slow, patient control that had taken over 3 years of her life before either of us fully understood what was happening. And she told me, the first time she mentioned it, that she wanted to be the kind of person who could see the pattern earlier than she had, who could say something to a friend or a sister before the cage was fully built rather than after. I think about that Sunday afternoon in the driveway often, the moment I asked a question I already half suspected wouldn't get a true answer, and I think about how close I came in that moment to letting it go, to telling myself that Casey was an adult, that her marriage was hers to manage, that fathers who push too hard risk pushing their children away entirely. I think about how thin the margin was between the version of this story where I let the lie about the car stand unexamined, and the version where I kept asking, gently, patiently, for 6 more weeks, until my daughter finally had somewhere safe to fall. I don't know that every father would have noticed what I noticed. I don't know that every father has spent 31 years learning to hear the specific silence of a story that's missing something. But I know now, in a way I didn't fully understand before any of this happened, that the question, "Where's your car?" is sometimes not really a question about a car at all. Sometimes it's the first thread in a much larger and much quieter unraveling. And if you're lucky, if you're patient, if you're willing to keep pulling gently at that thread even when the person you love keeps insisting there's nothing there, you might just pull hard enough and long enough to find the person you love standing on the other end of it, finally ready to be found.